Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 103rd Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our discussion panels twice monthly to demonstrate the value of civil, productive, open-minded political discussion. Today, our panel will discuss our world-leading rate of incarceration of American citizens. Can we and should we do something about it? Today's panel, beginning on my left, is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. On his left is Jerry Ritzman, co-founder of Ritzman Pharmacies. And on his left is Patty Haskins, retired math teacher and member of the Wadsworth City Council. On her left is Bryan Laubaugh. We got that all wrong, didn't we? Anyway, Ron, today the United States has 716 out of 100,000 citizens incarcerated. That amounts to nearly 2,300,000 people, or 22% of the world's prisoners. 22% of the world's prisoners are in American jails. Are we prone to criminal behavior, or is it something wrong with our criminal justice system?
It's interesting you should ask the question that way, John, exactly. I thought, since we persist as a nation in misinterpreting the Second Amendment, we all have guns, go around shooting each other to solve our problems. We get a lot of people in prison because of that. And actually, I'll try to back up that liberal snarky comment a little bit. I came on a couple of interesting articles, both coincidentally from the Washington Post. One was by a couple of folks from the American Civil Liberties Union, another from a fellow talking about an author named James Foreman Jr. He's a Yale Law School professor and a former DC prosecutor. And he talks about, in a second book called Locked In by a Fordham University law professor, John Pfaff. And he says, even if everyone in state and federal prison in a drug conviction released tomorrow, the U.S. incarceration rate would still be about quadruple what it was in 1970. And because most people in prison are there for violent crimes and homicides, not for drug-related things. Mm-hmm. We did get a big surge in the 90s. There was a huge crime spike, particularly in the African-American populations. And the African-American community responded to that, jailing their own, putting their own in prison, commented. What would Dr. King do? We're not having peace here, we're having a lot of that. And I don't have really backup for that, but my guess is that this is more a poverty situation than a drug situation. People who are in desperate straits will do desperate things. And part of that became a more violent sort of situation. Now, in the the Bill Clinton
94.
94. This did impose some mandatory minimum sentences, so that people with drug convictions tended to have more harsh convictions. But somebody pointed out that, one of these authors pointed out that it's not so much the federal government putting these in, but most of these convictions are happening on the county level. The many counties in the United States have a primary responsibility for prosecuting drug offenders and other offenders, and these tend to be more severe. And it is an economic thing. The county doesn't pay for it, the state pays for it.
They were responding, though, to the incentives provided by
They're
the crime
responding
bill.
to the incentive part of that, and it's an economic situation. The county gets the money to prosecute, but the state picks it up. So now we have the state prisons are overflowing. Mm-hmm. But also has been pointed out that the federal convictions, the federal emphasis, this is a small part of it. It's really more of a local issue. Now, I think it is part of the criminal justice system. I don't think it's necessarily the drugs. I don't know if it's poverty is behind it exactly, but and I don't have an answer for it. But I think it is a problem in this country. Perhaps it's the prevalence of a violent way of solving our problem, which is part of our history, part of our mm-hmm. group culture. Mm-hmm. I think that's all a part of it. It all comes in here. So I'm willing to hear what some other comments might be here.
Bryan, I hope you're going to counteract some of the
Well, I don't disagree that we have an issue with our jails and correctional facilities, but I think Ron pointed out and touched on a topic that I think really has a large bearing to the problem that we're suffering now, and that is the poverty that we have in our country. I believe, and I've got some numbers here that I think bear it out, that the welfare state that was created with the war on poverty is a large part of the issue. In 1964, only 7% of the children were born to unmarried parents. In 2013, 41% of those children, 41% of those families, of those children are born to unmarried individuals. A survey done in 2004 of the inmates in federal and state correctional facilities points out that 57% of the inmates come from a single-parent family. Most of them have been raised by mothers. Now, I'm not arguing that mothers don't do a great job, but statistically, a child, whether it be female or male, has a greater risk of being almost 2 times to be incarcerated, 6 times more to be in some brush with the law. Every indicator points to the importance of having a father in the home. I think we have to stop the flow of these people into the system, or slow it down. When a child grows up without a father, all the indicators point to issues with behavior, drug use, having basically perpetuating the welfare state in that they have children out of wedlock, and that poverty is then intergenerational. And the only way they know how to get out of that is through a lot of these crimes that they, drug use, selling drugs, and a lot of violent crimes. Young boys that are raised without a father are like 12 times more to be aggressive. I mean, the numbers are just off the charts. So I think this part of the solution needs to be the reestablishment of the father in the home, and that welfare program has to change, because now the Heritage Foundation, now obviously I want to make sure everyone knows that they're a fairly conservative group of a think tank. They point out that the welfare system promotes single parenthood because, number one, it's means tested. So the more that individual makes, the less benefits they get. Number two is it penalizes low-income parents. So if the single mother gets married, all of a sudden her benefits drop off drastically. So they're still in poverty, they're just not getting any benefits. So we need to rethink this whole issue and say, what can we need to provide a solution, not just treating the symptom of throwing these people in prison. We need to look back and start somewhere. I mean, it took us 40 years to get there, and it's going to take us a while to get back to some semblance of why are these people ending up in prison. I don't think it's just a fallacy in policy. I don't think it's just they're bad people. I think something went wrong, and you have to point to certain factors that social scientists are now beginning to realize that the father in the home is more important than just bringing extra money or a paycheck.
Excellent point. I think you might note though, that in terms of marriage, that's fallen off in the Western world. More and more people are not getting married, whether they're living together or not. I can fully agree with your analysis here about the lack of father, the lack of parental support. I know many single mothers who do a very fine job.
That there is no doubt about that. And what the studies point out is the single mother that is educated and has come from a 2-parent family has more of a likelihood, and that child has more of a benefit. But the uneducated, intergenerational welfare family, those children, you hate to say the word doomed, but the likelihood of them not succeeding is it's an order of magnitude of 2 or 3. I mean, it's crazy.
Jerry, where are you coming from on this topic?
Just referring back to Ron about the violent crime, more violent people in prison because of violent crimes versus drug offenses. I don't know if there are statistics that say how many of those violent crimes are related to drug use or trying to get the means to purchase drugs, or because of somebody being
Don't know that.
yeah.
That was
So
broken down.
if you talk to law enforcement people individually, they'll say that there's a high percentage of the crimes that somehow are related to drug use. So, but I don't know there. But in response or observation to what Bryan is saying and Ron's agreeing with, any of the things that we do, it seems legislatively have unintended consequences. And it seems that when there's something wrong, our first knee-jerk reaction as a society is to let's pass a law to fix this.
Yep.
And maybe that's not it, because we, I think, as individuals or as a group of smart individuals, have an inability to predict the outcomes of some of these things. So we really need to be careful as to how we approach any of these
Unexpected
things.
consequences.
Yeah, I mean it's difficult to do that. So we would need to tread slowly and deliberately. And oftentimes some of these, I think, or my observation is that sometimes the legislative fixes are done by individuals or legislators who the outcome of this legislation doesn't really going to affect my personal life. It's not going to affect my neighborhood or where I live or anything like this, or and so they're having other people live with the consequences of their decisions on legislation. So we would need to tread carefully as we try to fix this situation.
Patty, what kind of left-wing nonsense do you have about this subject?
I love your lead-ins. This obviously is a very complicated subject, because there's not just one reason you can put your finger on as to why the incarceration rate is so high. I mean, we can look at things such as the 3 strikes rule, which no matter what the crime, you could be stealing a pack of gum, but if it's your 3rd strike in some states, you're going to be in for life then. So that increases the number of, inmates that we have in prisons. We also want to look at the fact that many times because of the bill, many times first-time offenders are put into jail for lengthy times because of a minimum sentence requirement.
And for life, they are a convicted felon.
Yeah, and also, and I think this is one thing that you had mentioned in some material you gave us, that so many plea deals go on, where if you're poor and all you can afford is you have to use a public defender who may not really have his heart in the matter. You accept the plea deal whether you were guilty or not, just to make it go away for fear of having something worse happen to you. One other thing that no one has mentioned too, I think, is we saw an onset of a lot of for-profit prisons. And I know Obama tried to curtail these actually and get rid of some of them, but they're coming back now. And the only thing is with those, they don't work unless they've got a full house. And this can lead to corruption. There was a case in 2008, and I just learned about this, and it was a scandal called Kids for Cash. And it occurred in Pennsylvania, and there was a very large documentary done about it. And what was happening is these 2 judges were accepting kickbacks for sending juveniles to this for-profit private detention center. And millions of dollars were exchanged. They state that over 2,000, kids were sent to these detention centers for things like shoplifting a DVD from Walmart, first offense, being in a vacant building where they shouldn't have been, for trespassing. I love this one, mocking a school principal on social media, and then sentenced to this. This is tragic. The judges that were involved were sentenced to very lengthy sentences. It was interesting. They actually had a plea deal where they wouldn't have to serve as long. and their behavior afterwards caused the trial judge to bring them back into court, revoke the plea deal, and I know the one was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison, and the other got something like 18 years in federal prison. There's been a lot of talk about these private, for-profit prisons, and there are many that are pushing for them, and they're pushing for them now with a new administration, but they tend not to be interested in the rehabilitation, but rather just filling up a space. Another thing that we maybe need to look at is alternative punishments, as opposed to, traditional, like when you have a minimum sentence, you have to give them this many months, this many months. Are there alternative ways to treat or to punish those convicted of minor crimes rather than just throwing them into prison? I don't know. I know some judges have tried some alternative methods, which some people thought were humiliating or whatever, but perhaps we need to look at alternative ways.
Yeah, you mentioned mandatory sentencing, and I believe that that's one of those things where politicians are responding to the public outcry.
You don't want to get the slap on the wrist. Yeah.
There were so many cases of violent criminals, horrible criminals, who were given little to no penalty, slap on the wrist, that sort of thing. And so anybody that suggested we have mandatory sentencing, let's not leave this up to the judge. Let's send him away for 25 years rather than 25 months. And of course, then politicians will jump on that because it's got public support. But it turns out taking the judgment away from juries and judges has, to Jerry's point, all kinds of unintended consequences and all. But remember, the crime bill of 1994 was not necessarily a drug bill, but it turned out that way because of two things, namely the anti-drug grants that local law enforcement were able to get, and also the forfeiture of assets that turned out to be such a tremendous incentive for local law enforcement, to the point where in many cases they ignored other crimes. They ignored rapes, robberies, other kinds of violent crime because they were getting rewarded for drug convictions.
Well, and incarceration for drug use doesn't really solve anything because they still get the drugs in prison, number one. And instead of treating the person, and this is where we need more, I think we should get involved, is we need more treatment centers that are available for people, inpatient treatment centers for those that are convicted of drug use. And some of the inpatient drug treatment centers they're run basically like a prison, but you're treating the cause of the problem and you're hopefully putting out a better person, whereas sending a drug user to jail, you're not going to get a better person out of that jail at the end of that.
Got a case in point here. Recently, our church was sponsoring a young man who was incarcerated for drug use, and he was getting out, and he was still in the system, still in some of this, and he relapsed, and he's back in prison.
Yeah.
It just did him no good. He protested that he was clean, and he made himself unavailable to the drug dealers in prison. But it didn't last for the poor guy.
No, you need
What
treatment.
what did he fall into? Using or selling?
Using. Again.
Using.
And stole a car and kinds of things that happened subsequent to this. And,
Well, one of the problems is that one of the features of the 1994 crime bill was one strike and you're out when it came to things like welfare and food stamps, public housing.
Right.
So one strike, now you get a felony drug conviction, it's almost impossible to make a living in the legal economy. You just can't
Once
do
you
it.
get out, you're stuck. You have no home, no
Yes.
food.
And the bill also did not put many resources into prevention. into rehab and education and so forth. And I will say this, the Republicans fought tooth and nail to eliminate any of that touchy-feely stuff that they didn't like when it came to rehab and prevention and education. They didn't like it at all.
And it's not touchy-feely. It's
Well, I
something-
know, but that,
yeah.
those were my words.
Right, but I mean, it's,
I
you
know
know,
what you mean. Liberal stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the mandatory sentence, it's almost like it takes the judge totally out of it. You know, you may as well just have a vending machine, you know, you got 10 years, here's your ticket, you head
Yeah.
to jail. The judge has
Yeah.
nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
So, which doesn't, there seems to be a place where a judge could actually make a judgment
Yeah.
on these situations.
I know one of the things that is of concern now, especially to my liberal friend on my left, is Jeff Sessions has hired a very, very close ally in the Justice Department that is very, very much in favor of returning to all of the harsh features of the 1990s.
This is one of the articles I picked up.
I saw it there. That's why I'm bringing this up. Yeah. I'm sure you got something you'd like to say about that.
Well, he's confusing correlation with causation, and there's been a slight uptick in some of the cities over the last couple of years, but there has been a drop in others, and others have remained relatively straight. And if this were a uniform thing on the federal level, we would expect this to go up all over. And we've known, people were just saying now that the war on drugs didn't really work. You know, the fact that strive for maximum sentencing for minimum didn't work in the first place, and there's no reason for it to work again. Eric Holder in 2013 put then Attorney General put out a directive. Let's say here, all urge prosecutors to reserve the most serious charges for high-level offenses. And he directed him to avoid unnecessarily harsh mandatory minimum sentence for defendants whose conduct involved no actual or threatened violence, and who had no leadership role in criminal enterprise or gangs, no substantial charges of drug trafficking, and so on and so forth. And that worked. Mm-hmm. That worked to some extent. Mm-hmm. There's no reason for Sessions to revoke that. He again, he felt, as you say, he felt that the slight uptick that caused Donald Trump to, what was it, the ravages, the rampaging, you know, of our country should cease. But that was not uniform throughout the country.
Yeah. I have to give a lot of credit to the Obama administration for trying to reel back some of the provisions in the 94 Act, some of the more harmful things, and also in pardoning thousands of people that were in prison for very, very minor offenses.
He took a lot of heat for doing that, though.
He did, but he didn't get it from me. I respected that.
Yeah.
That part of what he did. Unfortunately, he had the opportunity to go a lot farther, and he didn't. And I think that, and I didn't realize this until the past couple of weeks, one of the reasons why he really couldn't go after the 94 crime bill as much as he should have, it was written by his vice president.
Right, Biden wrote it.
Yeah, this was essentially a Joe Biden initiative. And in fact, Joe Biden liked calling it the Biden crime bill. So he took a lot of credit for it. And unlike Clinton, who has apologized for a lot of the things that he acknowledges now were wrong and harmful, Biden still supports everything in the 94 crime bill. I thought that was interesting. The other thing that I wanted to point out, when it comes to the activities of local police forces, it is so much easier to get felony convictions in the black community than it is the white community. Partially because the populations are dense, partially because of, Bryan pointed out, poverty. The deals between public defenders and prosecutors on plea bargains, they sort of joined forces
They pointed out that the very large percentages never see trial. They'll go with plea bargaining,
90%,
yeah.
90% of the
Amazing.
prisoners in this country were plea bargained. They never saw a court room, and I think that's terrible.
It's expensive to do that.
Did you ever watch,
So
you
you
know, I
save
know
money.
here
So is
W-
it expensive to keep them in jail?
Well, sure.
WCTV has the court programs, and from Medina County.
Yeah.
And now, my guess is probably 90% of those are drug cases.
Yeah.
And when you consider how, and it's just one after another after another, and they're not going to trial.
Yeah.
They're before the judge. They're pleading guilty.
And
and
I'm glad Petty pointed that out, because when I watch it, that individual's been there in front of that judge multiple times. He's given them many opportunities. Like the one, you know, he came in, he was in the program to get clean, he was going to do all this kind of stuff, and then he ends up stealing a watch from his dad, and the parents end up having to file charges against him. So he's back in front of the judge, and the judge is doing his best to not send him to jail and give him that but it's not like the kid showed up to the first time and the judge said, "You're going to prison." It's the third or fourth time that it happens, and the family has exhausted all means to help that young man or young woman, and next thing you know, the judge has to put him in jail for a period of time and to try to get help. So I guess I kind of like the holistic approach to the issue, instead of just tinkering with some of the laws. And you know, a lot of these plea deals, there have been other crimes associated with that drug arrest. So maybe they don't have a strong, maybe they plea it down to, okay, we won't do this, but we're going to get you for the burglary. You know.
Well, there's one. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the fact that this past week it was announced that drug overdoses are now the leading cause of death in the United States.
The opioid.
The opioid, yes. And that one of the things that Jeff Sessions pointed out was that we need to make it very, very clear to the citizens of this country that drugs are bad. And I'm hoping that what he means is that to use the power of persuasion of the media to attack drug use, and that not returning to the old 94 stuff. Thank you very much. I'm going to skip the quote for today, but it was a very good one. Too bad we don't have time. Thank you.